Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. For today's topic, I'd like to discuss how to use art within your stories. Now, I'm not talking about how to make your story a multimedia affair with illustrations, soundtracks, and animations. What I'm talking about is how to use depictions of art in all its various forms as a way to make your setting come alive, and as a way to make your cultures distinct from one another. It's not an easy task, since describing art is never the same as experiencing it directly, but I'll try to get you started by going over a few different art forms and explaining how they change based on technology and geography. Poetry. Unlike most of the other art forms I'll be describing, poetry is the easiest thing that you can depict directly in your stories. A poem is usually short and easy to read, and even if you don't study the art, anyone can come up with a rhyming couplet or two. However, poetry is also hard to master, and it plays with language, imagery, rhythm, and sounds in a way that makes it effectively impossible to translate. In fact, any unique feature of a language, whether written or spoken, is exaggerated and played with in poetry. Originally, poems were a popular way to communicate oral history and myths. Poems are easier to memorize than regular sentences thanks to repetition and built-in mnemonics, and that's why epic stories like the Odyssey, the Tale of Gilgamesh, and the Tale of Beowulf were written in a poetic format. The stories were conceived of in rhyming verse, transmitted from one storyteller to another, and eventually someone wrote it all down. And it wasn't really until after prose stories became common that poets began to really play around with what poetry as a format can do. Prose. Prose is poetry, but without the linguistic flourishes. It's harder to memorize than a poem, but it's also easier to write and easier to translate. Prose tends to be the preferred medium for storytelling once writing things down becomes common, and from what we can tell, literacy has been far more prevalent than what we used to believe. The main difficulty for thousands of years was how hard it was to make writing surfaces and copy existing works. And so once the printing press made publishing easy, there was an explosion in the number of books, pamphlets, newspapers, and everything else that people could read. On the other hand, fiction as a distinct concept from nonfiction is a relatively recent development. While some stories were seen as allegories and thus obviously untrue, there was no real distinction made between myths, exaggerations, tall tales, and honest accounts of factual events. And even after the distinction was made, authors still intentionally mythologize about real people or ascribe real events to fake people. George Washington is famous for chopping a cherry tree that he never really chopped, and Paul Bunyan is a made-up figure whose axe carved the Grand Canyon. Painting. Painting is an art form that predates writing, but probably not storytelling. Archaeologists believe that the preserved cave paintings found in various parts of the world weren't created for their own sake, but were used as illustrations for oral stories about the world and about the tribe that drew them. And for thousands of years, that was the purpose of paintings, carvings, and other illustrations, to depict important figures, events, and myths. However, as paints became cheaper and easier to access, and especially after etchings made illustrations easy to copy, they became much more common and depicted much more mundane activities. But the big change to painting came when the camera was invented. Now that people and locations could be depicted with perfect accuracy, painters had no obligation to stick with realism, and so they started experimenting with depicting emotions, concepts, and impossible things that a camera could never capture. Sculpture. Originally, sculptures always depicted important things like human figures, gods, or the symbols that represented them. This is because sculpting took a lot of time and effort, and once it was finished, the only thing a sculpture would do was sit there and look good. So it had to be important, whether it was a big sculpture for a temple or a little sculpture for a household. Also, since 3 dimensions are much easier to depict with 3-dimensional objects, sculpture achieved full realism long before painting and other 2-dimensional illustrations. Even today, sculpture continues to be an expensive art form, especially as one moves away from the original stone and wood materials into things like ceramic, metal, and glass. In the modern era, sculpture has diversified. Some use sculptures to create three-dimensional abstract art installations, while others make their sculptures more impressive by vastly increasing their scale. Although to some extent, people have been doing both of those things since the dawn of history. Music. Music is a curious art form because it's sort of based on language, but far more loosely than poetry. Music tends to have a regional quality that's much more pronounced than it is in visual art forms, but at the same time, it's much easier to understand than a poem, even when the song in question has lyrics. It's my belief, at least, that music has a strong connection to our emotional states, because it kind of hacks the part of our brain that listens for vocal tones, and that aspect of it can transcend the language barrier. A sad song is always a sad song, no matter who listens to it. Because of this connection to emotions and languages, music is a constantly evolving art form that is and has always been prevalent in every class of society and in every era of history. However, it's also a very difficult art form to depict in a story, especially if you're not a musician. But what you can do with a story is describe emotions. And so the best way to describe music is with emotional language rather than technical language. Clothing. Much like music, clothing is a ubiquitous art form. It's so ubiquitous, in fact, that you're almost certainly making use of it right now. And make no mistake, clothing is an art form. While we may use clothing for practical purposes like protection and modesty, the colors, patterns, shapes, and cuts of our clothing are statements that we make both about ourselves and our culture. Geography and climate determine a few things about our clothing, like whether several layers are more useful than a few, whether dark colors or light colors are best for the heat, and what kind of head coverings can keep the sun and rain out of our eyes. But then you get to cultural distinctions, like whether to wear robes, skirts, or trousers, and in what situations, which colors and outfits are reserved for which professions and social classes, and which ways men and women are expected to dress to distinguish themselves from one another. There are also technological aspects to clothing designs. Making clothing was very labor-intensive for a long time, and so until relatively recently, most people outside of the upper class only had 2 or 3 sets of clothing, one to wash and mend, and one to wear. Certain dyes, especially vibrant dyes, were expensive to produce, and so clothing of those colors was rare, up until synthetic dyes became common. Some materials are more expensive than others, and even today they have a special status and cost. And while tailoring and customizing clothing used to be something that every household did, in the days of mass manufacturing it's now more common to just buy clothes that fit. Body modification. Body modification is just as decorative as clothing, but it serves no practical purpose and tends to be much more permanent. Piercings give people more places to put jewelry and other decorations. Tattoos turn your skin into a canvas and give you a permanent illustration you always carry with you. Scarification creates geometric patterns by using the different color of scar tissue, and the practice is more common among people with dark skin since tattoos don't show up as well. Then there are things like neck lengthening and foot binding, things that change a person's body shape, slowly but surely. Modifications like these tend to be limited to a single culture, and are not as broadly common as the first 3 I mentioned. You can also include hairstyles in this category, since hair is a part of the body and you can do all sorts of things with it that have cultural and artistic implications. Length, color, curliness, whether it's tied up or let loose, whether it's shaved and where, the appearance and thickness of facial hair, wigs, accessories, all of that stuff can change based on genetics, culture, and technology level. Food. Yes, food is also an art form. We don't have to add things like herbs and spices to our food, and we don't have to dress up a meal with extra colors and decorations, but we do it anyway. We do it because food is more than just calories and nutrients, and because cooks can express themselves through their creations. Much like music, food is both ubiquitous and very cultural in its influences, and yet good food is almost universal in its appeal. Specifically, peasant food, common food, for the most part, since whether something is a delicacy tends to depend more on how hard it is to get rather than how good it tastes. And with that in mind, you can do a lot to describe an invented culture by describing the food they eat on a daily basis. A culture in the tropics will have spicier food, a culture on the coast will eat a lot of fish, and the staple grain of a culture could be wheat, rice, or corn, depending on the region. Performances. Performance arts include storytelling, music, dancing, acting, magic arts, comedy, and a whole lot of other options that blend everything else together. Modern performance arts also include video recordings, and so if that's in play, you can also include film, animation, radio plays, editing, streaming, video game let's plays, and so on. Performance arts are about as easy as prose to translate between cultures and languages, but what's curious about them is that they tend to build up their own language of traditions and conventions that are unique to the specific genre and culture that birthed them. Greek actors would play their parts while wearing masks, partly to inhabit the parts, and partly so that the exaggerated features of the mask would be visible in the back seats. 20th century sitcoms would develop catchphrases that certain characters would repeat over and over again, because then the audience would repeat it and generate word-of-mouth advertising. Because of these traditions, it's easy to spot a performance created by someone from within the culture who knows all of the conventions, and one created by someone outside the culture who is simply imitating the art. Not that the imitation is necessarily bad, mind you. If an imitation is good, it often serves as the beginning of a new performance genre. And while this pattern can be seen in any art form, I'd say it's the most obvious in the performance arts. Non-human art. Here's where things really start to get fun. All art is an attempt to communicate using more than just words. However, it does so by appealing to our senses and to our primal understanding of humanity. So what would art look like to us if it was created by a species that has a different set of senses? How would a performance look when the species who performs it has a different instinctual understanding of body language? How would their visual art look when colors have different emotional resonances? Let's go over a few examples. If a species could see in a somewhat different spectrum to humans, then their artwork would feature pigments that come across as bland or garish to human eyes. If a species is nocturnal, they would have different emotional connections to light and darkness. If a species is covered in fur, then tattoos would be much less common, but hairstyles and shaved hair patterns would be much more common. If a species barely uses its eyes compared to its other senses, then visual arts in general would take second place to auditory arts or olfactory arts. Artistry can be hard to depict when you're telling a story, but any effort you make will be worth it. Because art is a form of communication, whatever you describe about a culture's art will tell your audience what that culture wants people to hear. So keep that in mind, both when you describe paintings and when you describe what people dress in and listen to. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.